Greetings, Professor McKee here with the next Seminar Saturdays. Today's topic is on social networks. This week's paper is called Executive Networks and Firm Policies, Evidence from the Random Assignment of MBA Peers. I promise there are papers that don't have the evidence from natural experiment subtitle. We just haven't gotten to them yet. And standard disclaimer on my pronunciation of the names. I apologize for any mangling that will happen. This paper was by Shue, published in Review of Financial Studies in 2013. So a few introductory notes. This is a solo paper, and this was her job market paper. So Dr. Shue, this was one of her main paper when she was a PhD student. And the other main thing to note here is this is one of the very rare papers that we have a randomized group here. So she says random selection in the title. There's a reason she says that. It's because this is really rare and very powerful in terms of convincing us that the things she finds are real. Usually with our natural experiments, there's always some doubt. But here, very solid setting, much more so than even the very best natural experiments. So, are CEOs robots? Well, of course not, right? They're humans like us, probably. So that means when they make important firm decisions, and there's a number of important decisions they make, they're going to have cognitive biases, like all humans, in particular, because we're going to be talking about social networks, influence from their friends, their peer group, peer pressure. And when we look at these important decisions, because these are public things we can see, does the CEO's peer group influence that decision? Now, from the shareholder perspective, it's either good or bad. We're not really sure. It could be good because we learn things from our peers, from our friends. And sometimes we learn good things. We learn good ideas. We learn information on how to do our job better. A lot of the CEO peers are probably going to be other managers. They learn how to do a better job managing the company. So that would be good. That'd be the good side. But of course, you also learn things that maybe are not so good. So they might learn bad things. They might learn to do bad things. They might try to do bad things to try and keep up with their friends, even if it's not a good idea for their company. This whole social network idea, like how the friend groups of the CEOs and board impact firm decisions, is there's a very large literature that looks at the CEO, looks at the board of directors, and says, okay, who are these people connected to? How does that influence their decision? And I picked this paper out of many possible ones, mostly because of the randomized groups here. That we have an actual randomized sort of a trial, and we don't usually have that with most of these papers. And there's a couple of reasons why we really want to have the random friend groups. First of all, whenever we have a social network paper, we have a couple of endogeneity issues. The first one is selection. We don't choose our friends randomly. We tend to befriend people similar to us. Well, CEOs aren't robots, probably, and they choose their friends. They don't randomly get assigned friends. And the problem here is because the CEO's friends are similar to them, if we know CEO Smith is friends with CEO Jones, and they make similar management decisions, is it because they're friends and they're sort of sharing information and talking about their management decisions? Or is it because they were similar people, which made them friends, and also which means they're going to make similar decisions? So this is the omitted variable. Same omitted variable, just a different sort of setting as what we have seen in previous weeks. Second one, common shocks, which is again an omitted variable. So are these friends similar because they are connected to each other, or because they both experienced a transformative event and they're friends because they're similar in age, and so they both grew up through World War II, or they both grew up through the Great Depression. And that actually is somewhat relevant for CEOs, because CEOs tend to be in their 50s or 60s, not much younger than that. So if we're talking about someone who's running a publicly traded company in 1990, he probably was born during the Great Depression or during World War II. But a more recent event, like living through 9/11. Big transformative events like that can affect everyone in the social network, and it can make it appear as though the social network causes similar behavior, when instead it's that common shock that causes the similar behavior. And a third problem, which is not really an endogeneity issue, but one that does cause problems for many social network type papers, is there actually a connection at all? Because we often can't directly observe that these two people are friends. And also, it's kind of hard to quantify friendship. Now, thanks to social media, sometimes people are kind of put their friendships out in the public square where everyone can see it, but that's not always the case. So suppose we know that they are connected because they are both members of a group. That is often how things work. If you graduate from the same university, you work at the same company, you're members of some other organization, both members, and then, you have a connection. But just because you both have an association with the same group doesn't mean you actually know each other very well. So an example here, which is a pretty small association, let's say both CEOs are members of the same country club. So it's a pretty small group. Clearly, right, they have a social connection then. But what if one CEO is an early riser? He gets up crack of dawn, or even before, and goes out and golfs at sunrise, and then goes off to work. And so he's gone by 10 a.m. And the other guy, he also likes golfing. That's why he's a member of the club. And he likes sleeping in. Or maybe he likes going to work and then around lunchtime going off to do his golfing. They're going to be at the country club, the same club, but they're not going to be there at the same time. So how much do they really interact with each other? We don't know. Now, with cell phone data, maybe we can track them a little bit, but that's a pretty recent phenomenon. So that's a potential problem here. Again, this setting deals with it because we know that they were forced to interact with each other for a lot, and we'll see why in just a minute. So the setting here is using Harvard Business School. So she is using connections through a common association that they're both graduates of the same MBA program. And because they're students together, that means, well, if you are familiar with MBA programs, particularly in-person MBA programs, there's going to be group projects. There's going to be classroom discussion. Especially at a really elite program like Harvard, there's going to be a lot of extracurricular activities to try and network, basically forcing connections. And that's a substantial part of the value of an elite MBA program, is that you gain a lot of connections with other very talented, successful people in business. And so they're going to be interacting a lot, at least while at Harvard, with people who are in the same classes as them. Now, she looks only at one school, Harvard, which still works for her, because while Harvard is not quite as dominant in the C-suite top executives today, it's still very dominant, and she's looking at people who are basically going to Harvard in the second half of the 20th century, so roughly 1950 through 2000. And Harvard was really dominant then. She looks at CEOs of S&P 1500, so the largest 1,500 publicly traded companies in the U.S., in a span of just about a little bit under 20 years. And she has over just under 600 CEOs or CFOs in her sample out of 1,500 companies. And probably most of those companies only had 2, 3, 4 CEOs or CFOs in that time span. So there's a very high percentage coming from just a single business school here. But that's because Harvard was so dominant, so elite. And the really nice thing that she has with Harvard is that Harvard splits all their incoming MBA students, and they have very large incoming classes, into sections. And Harvard randomly assigns students into sections. Now, they do a little bit of kind of balancing the demographics, so they don't have kind of weird sections just based on luck. But that makes it even better because these sections are even kind of more homogeneous then compared to each other, rather than having, kind of, there's only a handful of sections, of course, so we might see one weird section and that might drive some results. We might see, nope, all these sections are very similar to each other. They're just, people are then randomly put in after they adjust for some demographics. And these sections have pretty intense bonding, social connections within the section. So the sections take all their non-elective classes together. So again, if you've taken MBA classes, especially in-person classes, there's a lot of classroom discussion. There's group projects. You're going to get to know these people you take a bunch of classes with pretty well. There are lots of extracurricular activities in Harvard that are organized by section. So you do extracurricular stuff along with your other fellow section peers. They have alumni reunions. There are a bunch of events that are organized by section at those reunion events. She has an online appendix here where she sort of goes into the sociology research discussing specifically the Harvard section-based peer bonding. Apparently this is such a big deal that there's a whole small literature in sociology on how the connections work for these Harvard MBA students. There's also a previous paper by Lerner and Malmendier, which was published a couple of years before her, where they also use this random assignment to Harvard Business School sections. So the randomization is pretty solid here. And because it's Harvard, because Harvard was so dominant in top executive positions, she has a lot of executives who were at Harvard. She usually has at least one or two people inside the section who ended up a CEO, CFO, or at least one of the top 5 in the C-suite working at that company, which is kind of necessary. She needs to have enough people to actually find anything. So other data sources besides the alumni records she's using from 1949 through 2008. So she uses Execute-Comp to get the compensation, the pay of the CEOs, CFOs, also basically the top 5 for S&P 1500 firms. So the largest 1500, S&P 500, of course, is the largest 500. So it's that plus an extra 1,000 who are just below those top 500 companies. And this is a very widely used source for CEO compensation. I've used it a little bit myself. One of my main advisors at Iowa, Eric Lee, does a lot of work in CEO compensation. He uses that all the time. Like I'm somewhat familiar with that database, and it's a very widely used one. She's looking at mergers and acquisitions because that's a major strategic choice that CEOs make, and she uses SDC, which if you've been following along this semester, you've seen SDC before. It's a very common data source for M&A activity. She uses BoardX to supplement twice, actually, Execute-Comp for missing biography and employment history. So Execute-Comp has information on these top executives. BoardX somewhat replicates Execute-Comp, and it also focuses a lot on board of director information. I've also used BoardX for board of director information, and she does use board of director info a little bit as well in her paper. And CompuStat and CRISP for, of course, financials and stock prices. You'll see that in pretty much every paper that involves U.S. companies. So lots of different data sources that she's linking in together. She's basically taking the names from the alumni records and matching them to the names that are listed out in BoardX and Execute-Comp, and then BoardX and Execute-Comp have identifiers that link the companies that the executives are working at to SDC, to CompuStat, to CRISP. All right, so her methodology in terms of measuring the social connections is complicated. There's quite a bit of theory that she dives into in the paper. I'm not going to go into it. I'm not a theory person. So I will try to very briefly summarize kind of what she's doing, but again, there's a lot of technical math behind it that you can see in the paper. If you're really good at math, maybe you can follow along. So the first metric she uses, and there's an alternative approach she also will use, and we'll see those in the tables that are coming up, called the pairs distance metric. She's measuring the average absolute difference between your section peers versus the difference between your class peers. So everyone who was in the same graduating class as you, but they weren't in your section. And so she's basically getting a correlation between our section peers, because there's going to be multiple CEOs in a single section, and she's comparing that correlation with our correlation to class peers. Same class year, different sections, and seeing if there's a difference. We think, based on how sections are constructed, that social connections, if they're doing influencing, should be stronger within section, because you're interacting with your section peers much more intensely and much more frequently than everyone in the entire class. And just remember that common shock problem. Well, we're doing a comparison of people who graduate from Harvard in the same year. They were just in different sections. So they probably have a similar age when they graduate Harvard Business School. If there's any common shock that happened like through Harvard, well, they all went to Harvard at the same time. So that's controlled for. Like, the common shock is not a real issue here, because she's got these two random groups and they're basically experiencing something very similar besides being in different sections. Again, it's a very clean, very great setting. Being able to have a randomized selection here is just so good, and it's so rare. You'll probably never see a random thing like that in any paper this semester that I present, except maybe one. All right, so let's first look at our generic outcomes here. Are the post-Harvard Business School outcomes similar? More similar for section peers versus class peers. So we have a ratio where she's taking the section correlation based, roughly speaking, divided by class. And so if this number is bigger than 1, that means our section peer correlation was higher than the class peer correlation. All right. And she's doing a t-test here, the null hypothesis being that there's no difference. There's no difference in correlation between these two groups of peers. And she's not finding stuff. So the ratio is basically just 1. The t-value is 0. And this is probably because Harvard is deliberately sorting people. They want to have a gender balanced section. They want to have balance in terms of nationality, things like that. But it doesn't mean it's not random. It's just they've done a balancing while doing this randomization. And even if you look at only the people who eventually end up in executive comp, top 5 executive in terms of compensation, they're still not really any different. But now you look post-Harvard for your executive outcomes, not your pre-Harvard student characteristics. And overlapping directors, that means you're serving on this board of directors, the same board of directors as your section peer or your class peer, 20% correlation, 20% higher for your section peers, and p-value 0.02, so statistically significant. Working in similar industries as your section or your class peers, again about 20% higher, 1.27, 1.25. So they're more likely to work in similar companies as your section versus your class. And again, we have statistical significance here, 0.05, 0.01, depending on which industry measure we look at. Surprisingly, nothing for state, but they do see a really strong effect here with city headquarters. So you're working, the headquarters of the city you're working at, 60% higher commonality for your section and extremely strong p-value. It's 0.00. It's less than 0.01 by quite a bit. So it seems like in terms of their future careers, there's a lot of correlations, stronger correlations, when you are in the same section. And that's useful to know. Okay, yeah, they seem to sort of network with each other and kind of have more similar career paths. But what about their strategic decisions as CEOs? Because we probably care more about what are the outcomes of the CEO decisions than just what happens with Harvard Business School graduates. Although, of course, Harvard Business School graduates might be interesting in and of themselves. We in finance are more interested in the companies. So things like executive compensation, corporate investment, all sorts of things involved with capital structure like leverage, dividends, cash holdings. There's other things you might think of as well. Company size. There's a lot of, these are some of the things that are major strategic decisions that we think CEOs play a very large role in deciding. Of course, like executive compensation, the CEO negotiates with the board of directors on what his pay is going to be the next year. So obviously he plays a big role there. But major investment decisions about what you should have as your capital structure, how large you want to make your firm. Of course, corporate investment plays a big role in size. So we think the CEO has impact on these decisions. And so if they're influenced by their section peer, that might show up there. So the first thing she looks at is compensation and acquisitions. So how much is the CEO getting paid? And is the CEO attempting to do acquisitions? So she has her two measures of peer correlations here, the paired distance, which I mentioned earlier, and then the alternative one, which is the excess variance metric. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail on the math behind these. It's quite complicated. But a nice intuition for the gamma here, this little Y-looking Greek letter. If you have a 0.2 gamma, that means you have a 20% higher correlation with your section peer versus your class peer. So when she's logging the salary and bonus compensation of the CEO, 0.19, which means you are 20%, you have sort of a 20% correlation with your section peer pay. So if your section peer, who is also a CEO, receives an extra $100,000 in salary this year, you will be getting an extra $20,000, 20% of $100,000. So what she finds is that direct compensation, so cash, salary plus bonuses, seems to have a positive correlation. It's statistically significant with your section peers versus your class peers. When she looks at total compensation, there's not a lot there. Maybe there's some evidence for it based on this metric here, this specific specification, but there's a lot of not significant results here. And this does make some sense. So salary and bonus, those are fixed numbers that you can negotiate with the board each year. Total compensation is taking the direct compensation and it's adding the other sources, which are generally stocks. They're issued stocks in the company, and or they're issued call options, the right to purchase stocks in the company. And the thing is, you might be able to negotiate to get more shares of stock, more call options. Totally a thing that might happen in a CEO salary negotiation. But the actual value you gain from these shares of stock, the call options, is pretty heavily correlated with how well does the company's stock perform that year. And there's some, the CEO has some control over it, but not a lot. And expecting a pure effect to influence the company's stock price, that's a stretch. And the reason it probably doesn't show up for total compensation is for large publicly traded companies, which is what we're looking at here. The majority of the CEO pay is coming from equity. It's coming from the stock grants. It's coming from the options. It's not coming from salary. So if you look at actual CEO pay, which you can do, it's publicly available. Companies release it every year, what they're paying their CEO. You can see what what the composition of their compensation is, and it's going to be mostly equity. And so often you might see media stories like, oh, this CEO earned the most money of any CEO this year. Kind of know that it wasn't salary. It was probably because that company had a really strong stock market performance that year, and so his equity pay was really high. He's probably not going to be the highest paid CEO next year because there will be a mean reversion. Now, most CEOs aren't like Elon Musk and ask for 100% equity. They ask for some salary and bonus and then most equity. But the reason that, say, Elon Musk was the highest paid CEO for a year or several years even was because he was entirely equity and the company he was running did extremely well. You need both of those to really boost that total compensation a lot. So anyways, that's why total compensation probably doesn't show anything. It's because it's mostly being driven by equity, and equity, pure effects aren't going to do much with the increase in value for equity. And then she also looks at acquisitions. So she has a dummy variable if they attempted at least one acquisition that year in columns 5 and 6. And again, she's seeing a positive correlation. They are more likely to attempt acquisitions if their section peer also attempted acquisitions. Okay, so pay is correlated, acquisition attempts are correlated. Do note, we are, at least for now, agnostic on if this is good or bad. Acquisitions could be good or bad. Higher pay could be good if the CEO is becoming a better manager thanks to his friendship, his connections, or it could also be bad if he's not actually better, he's just pushing harder in negotiations, or he's trying to keep up with his friends, and the acquisitions are not good. She also looks at other firm policies. She doesn't really find a whole lot there. So she finds some evidence with investments. That one is fairly strong here with both measures. And a few scattered results, maybe firm size, which again, investment, if you invest a lot, your firm size will generally go up. Also, acquisitions count as investment, and acquisitions would therefore increase investment. They also increase firm size. So those going up is not super surprising, but leverage doesn't seem to have much happen there. They don't seem to change their dividend that much. Interest coverage, which is also involving their debt, their cash holdings. These decisions, we're pretty sure CEOs play a large role here. Also, we don't seem to be showing a lot of peer effects. So she's going to be focusing mostly on compensation of CEOs and acquisitions going forward, because there's not a whole lot in the other big capital decisions that we're seeing much correlations. Now, we're going to get to basically a natural experiment that she also has along with this random selection, which is alumni reunions. So let's say we assume that these correlations are correctly measuring that the social networks influence the CEOs. Well, when do networks influence people? I can kind of tell you from my personal experience. When I was in college, I was on a sports team, and my teammates definitely had an influence on my behavior, how I was speaking and thinking. And then the summer came, and I wasn't traveling on the bus for hours with them, and their influence faded. So it's when you're actually in contact with the peer, that's when their influence on you is the strongest. Now, of course, if you're friends with someone that was in your section, maybe you talk with them outside of class, outside of reunions. Maybe you call them, since this was 1990s, before we really had smartphones. But if you go to an alumni reunion, you're going to spend several days, chatting with all your section peers, maybe reconnecting with people in your section you haven't talked to that much in the past 5 years. So what Harvard does is they have a reunion for their MBA program every 5 years. So 5 years after you graduate, 10 years, 15 years, and so on. But they have a lot of section events. Like you go to an event and you're there at the gathering, whatever, with people that were all in the same section with you. So at the alumni reunion, we think they're more likely to interact more intensively with their section peers than their class year peers. Now, their class year peers are there too, of course. Now, there's choice involved here. Only 40% attend. But again, that section part is still randomly selected. You can't change your section after you graduate. And so what she looks at is, okay, the year after the reunion, because reunions are generally going to be like around homecoming in the summer or fall of the year, so not much is going to happen in the few months after the reunion. So it's going to be the year after where we should see the strongest effect if they are being more intensely influenced by section peers because of that alumni reunion. Well, I'm going to show it graphically first, and then we'll kind of get the actual numbers to quantify it. So this is compensation, and the year of the reunion is the lowest in terms of compensation, and then the year after, boom, it jumps up to a 0.25, so to the highest correlation relative to the class peers. And then it sort of decays a bit back down towards years 3 and 4, and then after year 5 is equivalent to year 0, because there's a reunion every 5 years, and it's going to jump up back again. So there's a noticeable jump in correlation the year after that reunion. Good to see. Again, she's showing error bars here, and you can kind of eyeball it and see that there's a gap. So there is statistical significance between these two, but we'll see it more formally in just a little bit. When she looks at acquisitions, again, there's a pretty low correlation. There's actually it's actually negative, although the error bar is quite large, so it could be positive. And it jumps a lot the year after the year after the reunion. And again, you can see our error bars here have a bit of a gap between them, so we probably are going to see statistical significance between year 0 and year 1. So these are, I think, great graphs that show, because it really shows the big effect that the reunion year appears to have, and now we're going to see the numbers. So reunion year +1 for that gamma, which is our correlation, and then the distance ratios for reunion year +1 versus all other years. So the year where we think it should be the strongest, if they are reconnecting with section peers, and compensation is higher, acquisition temp is higher, and the statistical significance is quite a bit weaker in the other years. You might also note our distance ratio goes from 0.17 down to 0.07. It goes from a gamma of 0.4 down to 0.2, 0.19. So there's a gap. There's a gap there. And similar things happen with the acquisition attempts. So yes, it appears that there is indeed higher correlations for the direct compensation, the salary, bonus pay, and the acquisition attempts in the year following that reunion. Great. But there's more, because while we know that they have similar outcomes in sort of their career paths, we know that their pay and their acquisition attempts are correlated. What we don't know is it good or is it bad? Because it could be good, right? CEO pay could be increasing because our CEOs are learning from their section peers. They're learning more from their close friends, and they're doing a better job. as a CEO. Well, if you do a better job as a CEO, typically you get paid more. It's a difficult job to value. Jobs are always hard to value, but generally speaking, on average, if you're performing better, you tend to get paid more. And you get to negotiate every year, so you can kind of point to, hey, I'm performing better, and you don't need to explain why, of course, and then ask for more money. Alternatively, it could be that they see their peers making more money, and they just push harder when they negotiate with the board to ask for more money, and they squeeze the company harder, and to try to keep up with their friends, and it's not because they're better. In which case, the company is sort of losing. Could have hired the same CEO for less money, if not for the social network, so it's kind of bad for the firm. Similar thing with acquisitions. There's potentially the case that the CEO learns from the section peer how to better do acquisitions, better identify targets, the acquisition process, doing that more efficiently. Once you've acquired, integrating the company that you've bought more effectively. And there's acquisitions are relatively rare. Companies don't do lots of acquisitions that much. In absolute terms, it's not a very large amount. And so CEOs are not going to have tons of experience on how to do an acquisition. So learning from their friends who've also done acquisitions, maybe they learn from that. I've kind of seen, going way off topic, wars are relatively rare. Military commanders tend to only fight in one war, maybe 2 wars at most. And so military commanders probably have a similar problem as CEOs here with acquisitions. You don't have a lot of direct experience how to fight a battle, how to command an army. You know stuff from theory maybe, but practical experience is hard to come by. So learning from your peers who have practical experience might actually make you better. That's an entirely different academic area, so I have no idea if that's actually true or not, but the rarity of acquisitions is somewhat similar there. Alternatively, maybe they see that their section peers are doing better than them. They're running bigger companies. Bigger is better. Bigger is more prestigious. Bigger also means you tend to get paid more. So they grow firm size by acquiring, because that's an easy way to grow firm size. They're not doing it because they're better at acquiring and they're better at finding good targets and doing the acquisition process well. They just do it because they want to puff up their own ego, their own bank account, their own prestige, which of course that's going to be bad for a firm. There are lots of acquisitions that are bad for companies and decrease shareholder value. And there's a huge literature both on CEO pay, how to best pay CEOs, compensation, and so on. There's also huge literature on what makes for a good acquisition, what makes for a bad acquisition. And this paper kind of connects both of these to those social networks. Okay, so let's start with CEO pay. So what the author Shue is going to be doing is finding a plausibly random increase in this case, for your peers' pay, and then see what happens with your pay. Because let's say the entire industry has a good year. That means most companies, probably all companies in the industry, also have good years. Well, if your company has a good year, the CEO is going to be able to get more pay next year. Even if the CEO didn't really deserve it, right? In this case, the industry did great. It's not because the individual company did well, because of the CEO doing a good job. It's just because a rising tide lifted all boats. But the CEO is still going to be able to negotiate for more pay for next year's contract. So a lucky industry shock increased your section peers' pay, and it's not because your section peer is doing some new management strategy that makes the company perform better. It was just luck. So if your section peer has a lucky increase in CEO pay, if your pay also goes up, it's probably because you're trying to keep up with your friend and not because you learned something from your friend, because there's nothing different about your friend from the previous year. Probably. Well, that is what's happening. So first stage is there's a shock to that industry. And then she's looking at your direct compensation and then your total compensation. Of course, not much happens with total compensation. So your direct compensation is increasing when your buddy, your section peer buddy, has an increase that's lucky. So it suggests that the higher pay is coming, at least in part, and again, this is the direct paid, there's nothing going on with total compensation, is coming through you're trying to keep up with your peers, not because you're a better CEO, thanks to your peer network. And what she's basically doing is this industry shock. If you want more details on that industry shock, there's a paper by Bertrand and Mullainathan. Apologies for mangling that name. I know I mangled that one. From back in 2001. I'll have a link to that paper in the video description. If you're interested in a much more recent paper that looks at sort of lucky increases in CEO pay, there's one by Andreani, Ellahie, and Shivakumar in 2022. And again, I will have a link to that description, or link in the video description to that paper. So, bad news for pay. It's because of your friend's luck, not because your friend is helping you become a better CEO. Okay, what about acquisitions? Okay, so she makes an assumption here that acquisitions immediately the year after the reunion are more strongly influenced by the social network, given that we saw acquisition attempts went up after the reunion. This is a pretty reasonable assumption, at least in my opinion. And then she tries to identify acquisitions that are more likely to be bad acquisitions, because there's lots of acquisitions. Many of them turn out poorly for the company. Probably the majority of acquisitions turn out poorly, quite frankly. And she does it in a couple of different angles, because there's not one great, perfect way to do this. So she looks at market returns on the acquisition announcement. So you announce we're going to try and acquire this company. What happens to the stock price immediately following that announcement? If the stock price drops, the story goes here, well, the market thinks this is a bad acquisition, so more likely that it is a bad acquisition. There's problems there because just like with government decisions, acquisition decisions are, made privately and then you publicly announce it, so stuff leaks. I've seen papers that have shown evidence that kind of the acquisition news slowly leaks out, and you see an increase in the target's stock price leading up to the event of the announcement, but there's no perfect measure here for bad acquisitions. She also looks at if the acquisition is outside the industry. So you are you're General Motors and you're making an acquisition, you're buying Walmart. Just for a silly example. And so those are obviously very different industries. Walmart does retail stores and General Motors builds cars. And there's at least a correlation where if you diversify your company, so you buy outside your own industry, that tends to go poorly for you. Which makes some sense. If you're the CEO of General Motors, hopefully you're good at building cars, but you're probably not good at managing retail stores because the skills there are not really the same. And so you try to integrate Walmart into your company and it doesn't go well because you're not good at retail stuff. That's the idea. And then the other thing she looks at is if the acquisition attempt is being paid with equity. So you can pay with shares of stock, your own shares of stock. You can issue new shares and use that to purchase the target. Or you can pay in cash. You have cash sitting around, you slap it down, and you buy the company. And there's at least a correlation that if you purchase with equity, that tends to be a worse acquisition. That basically the acquirer's stock price, medium to long term, goes down after an equity acquisition. Now, this is a bad measurement. I don't think it's correct to use this, and I will explain a little bit why. I might someday actually go through the paper that does it because the paper is really cool. But there's a paper by Savor and Lu in 2009 where they look at is equity acquisitions bad or not? And what they basically find is no, they're not bad. What is happening to spoil that paper is companies that do equity acquisitions do them because their stock price has shot up a lot. It has shot up too much. And so they temporarily are overvalued. They make the attempt, and whether they succeed in the acquisition or not, their stock price comes back down because of mean reversion. And that's why it looks like a bad acquisition when, and actually it's not actually a bad acquisition. Making the acquisition actually helps them. It just, they're always going to go down because they're up so high that mean reversion is going to kick in and bring them back down to earth. But I will shut up about Savor and Lu because that paper I'll probably present it at some point, and it's a cool paper, so I don't want to spoil that too much. Again, that I will link to that paper in the video description if you want to have some spoilers or read about how they kind of show that paying with equity is not actually that bad. And then the last thing she does, which I think is probably the most useful here, is that, okay, they're learning about acquisitions. If the learning story is right, when they see their peers increase acquisitions, they'll learn more about how to do acquisitions. So they'll do more. They'll do acquisitions more often. But if their peers aren't doing acquisitions, they won't be learning as much, and so they won't acquire as much. Their acquisitions should decrease if their peers are not doing acquisitions. So we should see both a positive correlation on the my peer acquires, I acquire, and effectively a positive correlation with my peers don't acquire, so I don't acquire too. Two negatives gets you to a positive. Now, if they're only just trying to keep up with the Joneses, keep up with your peer, keep your company size, with your fellow section peer CEO, then if they're decreasing acquisitions, you're not going to change what you do with acquisitions because you don't really care, and you're not learning about how to do acquisitions better, as in not do them. So you're not going to decrease when they decrease. You're just going to increase when they increase if you're trying to keep up with them. I think that's a very clever approach, and it's what works best for her. So she doesn't actually report announcement results. She just says in the paper, it was null result. There's nothing there. When she looks at equity financing and diversifying, yes, they are more likely to be diversifying acquisitions, and they're also more likely to be equity financed. Now, the statistical significance on equity finance is pretty weak. Also, I don't really buy that this is a problem for an acquisition, so good for her. It's good for her that it's weak, because this is not what's going to convince me that she's right. This one is much more convincing, definitely on statistical significance at the very minimum. But then she looks at what happens when my buddy is doing acquiring or my buddy isn't doing acquiring. When the buddy is doing acquiring in the reunion year, or reunion year plus one, yep, acquisitions, attempted acquisitions, and completed ones go up. When it's the reunion year plus one and my buddy's not doing acquisitions, I don't do anything. It's just a null result. If I was doing learning, this should be negative and significant. Or we should see statistical significance here. You should be responding, and you're not, and they're not. So she takes that as evidence of, hey, they're only increasing acquisitions in response to their buddies increasing acquisitions. So it cuts against that we're learning how to do acquisitions better, and more towards we're just trying to grow company size to keep up with our section peers. Okay, so the rest of the paper, there's some additional robustness tests she does. One thing that is in the appendix, which is kind of cool, I thought, she does a triangulation using donation campaigns. So she somehow gets from Harvard who donated during the reunion, because there's like a campaign they do to try to get the alumni to donate money during the reunion. And so if the CEO donated money in the reunion, obviously the CEO is probably a lot more likely to actually have shown up at the reunion, and she finds that the compensation increases in correlation, acquisition increase in correlation is even higher than normal than the base results she presents in the regular paper when she looks at just those CEOs who donated money to the campaign. So a nice little robustness test there. I kind of like that. And it makes a lot of sense. If you donated money, you're more likely to have attended, which means the effect of the social network links being intensified are going to be higher. After all, only 40% on average attend. So there's kind of the effect is the social network increase is going to be weakened because only 40% of your section peers are there, and you might not be there at all. So in which case, you within that sample, you're not going to be the one driving the higher correlations. Okay, so that you can look at that if you want yourself. Let's wrap this up. So, in conclusion, CEOs are not robots, and that's bad. All right. Well, yes. So, very nice random sample here. This is the ideal form of a paper, and we almost never get to see it because we so rarely get random samples. So it's really nice to see it, to have this random sample, because just the endogeneity issues always make you worried. What you think you see as causality isn't actually causality, but here it's a random sample. It's the best we're ever going to get. And what we find is that CEO salary and CEO acquisition attempts appear to be influenced by their social connections. And it's likely a net negative for a company. They're getting more pay, not because they're better, just because they negotiate harder. They're trying to keep up with their buddies. They acquire more, not because they're better at acquiring, but because they're trying to keep up with their buddies. So these are probably net negative things for the company. Now, I said earlier, there's tons of papers in this literature looking at how social networks impact the company, how do the social networks of the CEO, the board members impact company. This is a paper that says this is bad. There's lots of papers that say this is bad. There's also lots of papers that say it's good. There's very mixed kind of findings. Probably both are true. There's some good things about having social networks. There's also some bad things about having social networks. Just like with all of us, sometimes our peers are good influences on us. Sometimes they're bad influences on us. All right, so that is all for this week. And next week we'll be talking about one of the other AFA papers. So a much more recent paper. See you all then.